O mundo capitalista enfrenta uma espiral de concentração de renda e desigualdade que prejudica o bom funcionamento da economia de mercado. Muita riqueza no topo, pouca embaixo, com dano maior aos que têm menos. Na esteira da crise financeira que explodiu em 2008, a economia de vários países ainda sofre com estagnação, desemprego e mesmo recessão, como no Brasil. Dramas que afetam ricos e pobres, mas de forma desigual. Nesta hora, pregações de austeridade e cortes de gastos públicos como única saída, acoplada à redução de benefícios sociais para diminuir despesas do governo, viraram quase um dogma entre economistas tradicionais de tendência liberal. Era o caso do ex-ministro da Fazenda, Joaquim Levy, seguidor da linha teórica associada à Universidade de Chicago, onde ele obteve doutorado. Mas outros especialistas no setor questionam o valor dessas receitas, de que o essencial é apertar os cintos para um dia colher frutos. É o caso do novo ministro da Fazenda, Nelson Barbosa, seguidor de uma linha menos ortodoxa, mais de olho em incentivar crescimento. Esta é também a base teórica do americano Joseph Stiglitz, ganhador do prêmio Nobel de Economia em 2001, que se recusa a ver apenas virtudes na austeridade, sempre mais dolorosa para quem está por baixo, adverte ele. É professor da Universidade de Colômbia e representante do pensamento econômico, herdeiro de John Maynard Keynes, o reverenciado economista e teórico britânico. Stiglitz sustenta que a obsessão em equilibrar as contas do governo pode levar a bloqueio de investimentos públicos necessários para a economia se recuperar, sobretudo quando o setor privado se retrai. Quanto ao argumento de que governos submetidos a altas taxas de juros internas não podem se endividar mais, o Nobel de Economia recomenda examinar melhor se as taxas precisam mesmo ser tão altas. Joseph Stiglitz esteve no Brasil a convite do programa cultural Fronteiras do Pensamento.
You have been a severe critic of the economic policy of austerity, with its focus on balancing public accounts above anything else. As you probably know, that's a very hot topic in Brazil right now. Has this austerity become like a golden rule, the new standard everybody's supposed to follow?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. And it applies even when countries shouldn't be tethered by it at all. You know, United States is an example. We can borrow at a negative real interest rate. That is to say, the interest rate taking into account of inflation is actually negative. And anybody who visits the United States can see that we need huge amounts of investments in infrastructure. We have bridges that are falling down, we need highways, we need airports, and yet we're not making those investments. Why? Because of this religion of austerity. If we were able to borrow this money and spend it on these investments, our economy would grow, unemployment would come down, wages would start finally to rise, and we would be better off. Now, there are other countries where
interest rates are very high.
Interest rates are very high.
Like Brazil.
Like Brazil, and they don't have as much ease in borrowing. So, you know, Greece is far worse. It has no choice other than to rein in expending according to what it can get. But Europe could have helped Greece. Europe could have eased the burden of austerity.
Behind this fixation with austerity, there's a hidden agenda of trying to reduce social benefits in general. In other words, we have this deficit, that we need to balance the books, so what do? We cut social benefits. It's the easiest thing to do.
Very much. This is very much part of the political agenda. You see it even from Draghi, who is in most ways
Mario
Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, done some dramatically positive things for saving the euro. And one interview with the Financial Times, he said the problem is excessively large welfare states. So it was very explicit. The agenda was to cut back on the welfare state. The interesting thing is, among the most successful countries in Europe are the countries with the strongest welfare states, the strongest commitment to try to create more equality, invest in their people, particularly in their youth, in Norway and Sweden. So the idea that the welfare state is the problem is not supported by the evidence.
The IMF used to be the boogeyman in Latin America in the 80s when the debt crisis was around here. And now it seems to have moved on to Europe. But it's not just the IMF now. You have the IMF and the central bank, the European Union in general. It seems like Latin American all over again over there.
It does very much so. But there's a curious change in terms of what the IMF says, and it's turned out to be among the, I don't want to say good guys, within the what is called the troika.
Compared to the others, yeah.
Compared to the others. Let me just give you an example in terms of what the IMF has been saying. The IMF has been saying that inequality is a major problem, that countries with more equality grow faster, are more stable than countries with higher inequality. So they've been warning against cutbacks on the welfare state. That's been at the philosophical level. When it comes to the actual program levels, the guys working in the country, they sometimes forget what the message coming from their research department, the evidence. But even then, the IMF has been the strongest proponent for debt restructuring. You know, saying a basic principle, countries, people often get over indebted. And it's as much a problem of the lenders as the borrower. These are voluntary transactions, and you can say the borrower borrowed too much. You could also say the lender lent too much.
They had the experience. They learned with practice.
And the lenders are more at blame because the lenders keep doing it. The borrowers often are. This is the first time they've gotten into debt. The point is that the IMF has realized that Greece, for instance, needed debt restructuring. Germany, many of the other European powers refuse to recognize, take into account reality, and they're trying to, we have an expression, squeeze water out of a turnip or squeeze water out of a stone. You can't do it. Yeah. And so that's part of the religion of austerity. They seem to believe, against all the evidence, that if we just suffer enough, if Greece just suffers enough, it will grow.
One of the fears, when we talked about the IMF being the bogeyman in the old days here in Latin America, nowadays it seems to be a new player, which is the credit ratings agencies. There's a panic amongst the Brazilian and other authorities worldwide of what these agencies are going to say, because all of a sudden your access to the market is limited. So it creates this submissive attitude and fear of what they can do. Is that a new element that we're dealing with?
Yeah, although it's been around to some extent for a long time.
But people didn't pay too much attention.
What I find so striking is the credit rating agencies' track record is miserable. So why people believe in them is another testimony, in my mind, to the irrationality of markets. Let me give you one example. The United States got a downgrade from S&P. only one of the rating agencies, but we got a downgrade.
As Brazil has.
As Brazil did, and it happened during one of the debt crises in the United States. Now, anybody who understands our debt market knows that the U.S. government bonds are all denominated in dollars. What does that mean?
You can always print the money.
We can always print the money. We will never default on our loans. And then you ask the question, well, maybe that money isn't going to be worth very much. But you look at what the market says, it says that we don't expect inflation anytime soon. So how do the S&P make these forecasts that say the U.S. is at risk of default? It's actually absurd. Now you look back into the period of the run-up to the recession of 2008. There they were irrationally exuberant. They were giving AAAs to these securities.
That turned out to be terrible.
That should have been given an F. Now we know from some of the records, which I've actually looked at, that they were basically engaged in fraud.
Inequality has been a concern of yours for many years, and your most recent book touches upon that. Other economists worldwide seem to be paying a lot of attention to that, from Thomas Piketty in France to your compatriot Robert Reich in California. Is inequality getting to be not only worse, but worrisome?
In America, we conceive of ourselves as a land of opportunity, the American dream. You start looking at the data, it's a myth that the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country. So that as we get more inequality, we actually get a poor performing economy. For instance, if you have inequality that's a result of market power, monopolies,
concentration of wealth.
Concentration. Then what you're doing is, at the same time you're getting more inequality, you're getting a more distorted and a less productive economy. And there is increasing evidence that that is the case in the United States and in other countries. What we see is persistent differences in economic returns across firms. Those firms that have monopoly power get higher returns. Financial markets are not equilibrating it because it's market power that is driving the inequality.
You don't think they paid a price for the crisis that they were responsible for, the financial markets?
Oh, very much not.
They got away with it.
And that is one of the underlying aspects of American politics, the sense that those who created the crisis of 2008 didn't bear any of the cost, didn't take responsibility, while millions of Americans lost their homes, millions of Americans lost their jobs, millions of Americans saw the savings that they had worked so hard to accumulate disappear overnight.
When dealing with inequality, as you do in your book, you keep thinking of that expression, the politics of envy, which usually, obviously, is the rich people use towards the poor ones, and say, well, you're criticizing the rich because you're envious. That's a defense mechanism, isn't it? Because
very much so, and in both my book, The Price of Inequality, and my book, The Great Divide, I addressed that. There was a wonderful quote from Warren Buffett, who is one of the, you might say, the rich. And he said, you know, when people talk about the politics of envy and the class warfare, he said, yeah, it's obvious there's class warfare, and our class has won. The point is, it's not the politics of envy. It's looking at what actually is happening in the United States. And one of the central points that I make, and now the IMF makes in my book, I make it in my book, The Price of Inequality, is that this great divide that has opened up in our economy and our society is actually leading to a less efficient economy. So everybody, even the 1%, are paying the price.
And there is also this, as we refer to, you mentioned the religious aspect of this belief, excessive belief that the market has to solve it all. It's usually claiming that the government, the state shouldn't interfere too much. Let the market operate by itself, and because it will solve all the problems. That's another aspect of dogma, isn't it? That you don't really go for that.
No, it is dogma, and the reason why I say it's dogma is that over the last 40 years, a central theme of economics is trying to understand the circumstances in which markets are efficient, in which Adam Smith, whose idea was that markets would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. What are the conditions under which that's true, and what are the conditions in which it's not true? And the striking thing is that the conditions under which true are extraordinarily restrictive and are not satisfied, not even nearly satisfied, in any market economy. And one of the important results of my own work was to show that even small deviations from those very strong assumptions could have very big effects and lead to very large inefficiencies.
And you do need regulations. You do need state participation, state intervention in many ways, just to keep not to impose socialism, but to keep capitalism going.
To make the market work. One of the major aspects of my economic agenda has been, let's make markets work like markets. And one of the conditions that markets need, if they're going to work well, are competition and transparency.
Obviously, your way of thinking contrasts with the frequently called Chicago School of Economic Thinking, which seems to become so prevalent worldwide. Don't you find that you're more and more becoming a minority, and there seems to be one way of economic thinking that is prevailing everywhere, including here?
Well, since 2008, there's been a marked change in the United States. I won't say the Chicago School has disappeared, but even in Chicago, there are a number of people saying, well, we have to look at market irrationalities, individual rationality. People like Richard Taylor, Cass Sunstein, even some of the leading Chicago economists have said, well, markets didn't work very well in the crisis of 2008 and have been induced to re-examine their fundamental beliefs. Judge Posen is an example. So the point is that there is the beginning of a re-examination. There's a creation of something called the INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking. There are leading economists at MIT, at Harvard, at Berkeley, Columbia, all have challenged
questioning
what was called the Chicago School. Unfortunately, in many other places, those who were taught in the Chicago School in the period of its dominance are now teaching. And so you see this in Latin America particularly, you see this in some European, they want to be good economics, but their view of good economics was the economics of the 1980s in America.
Can you see the Chicago School of Thinking, the old Chicago School of Thinking, serving a leftist government?
I find that very hard to understand because those doctrines, if they haven't rejected them, and as I say, some Chicago economists have re-examined but the doctrines of Chicago austerity, Chicago markets are efficient, those doctrines are antithetical to what I would call modern economics. Let me just give you one example, two examples of modern thinking in macroeconomics being taught at Harvard, MIT, Columbia, and at some of the leading thinking at, say, the Bank of England, a recognition of what we call macroeconomic externalities. So when you have the simplistic models that were informing thinking before the 2008 crisis and led to the crisis, they assumed a representative agent, as if the economy was well described by a single individual or identical individuals. Well, in that kind of world, you have no distribution effects, you have no problems of asymmetries of information, differential information, because that would require schizophrenia. The person wouldn't know.
Well, I should interfere to say that that's what gave you the Nobel Prize. You know, is exactly studying that aspect.
But those models reject that idea totally, because with one person you can't have differential information.
So you see a contradiction there between what we're calling the old Chicago school of thinking and government of the left, let's say more socially oriented, more public oriented.
And what I'm saying, it's even
can't work together.
And it's even more profound because their models, their thinking, are inconsistent with modern economics, where you say, look at what one person does can have effect on the rest of the society. The banks, in the way they behaved, imposed enormous costs on the rest of the society. You can't let them just be unregulated. We call that an externality. These internal contradictions, you see them in every government, but here it's a little bit more dramatic.